Hello and welcome. My name is Nate from Video Games Recon, and now that all the DLC from Advanced Warfare has been released, and with Black Ops 3 around the corner, I figured it high time I did a comparison of Exo Zombies versus Treyarch Zombies. What it got right and what it got wrong, and some general discussion thrown in for good measure. And well, to overall let them duke it out for supremacy. So we have 8 categories in which I'm going to compare Exo Zombies to Treyarch Zombies, and at the end I'll hopefully refine my verbal diarrhea into some sort of a coherent summary. But knowing me, probably not. And as per usual, this is just my humble opinion, so as long as you're not going to be a dick about it should you happen to disagree, feel free to share your thoughts in the comment section regardless of what side of the fence you sit. Anywho, without any further ado, let's do it to it. So, let's start off on a good note. The map design as a whole I found to be decent, and I didn't have too many problems with it, especially taking into consideration the new movement abilities of the exosuit. Sure, sometimes the train areas were too big, and sometimes it artificially forced you to stay in some way too cramped situations to fight the undead horde in, but on the whole I found them to be decent. And it's not like Treyarch hasn't had its issues in that regard before. Take Transit and Die Rise for example. Although good concepts and still fun, were deeply flawed when put into practice. Next is the reverse side of the coin of map design, and that is general aesthetic. In this regard, Treyarch Zombies always excelled. Every map felt different and had its own character and story to tell. Be it the frozen wastelands of Call of the Dead, or the post-apocalyptic world of Nuketown, or even the subterranean Old West town of Buried. Every map's art style felt very distinctive and engaging, whereas for me the only map that has anything close to that in Exo Zombies is Infection, as with it being mainly outside helped it to feel part of an apocalyptic world, and to a greater degree the Burger Town area, which was both fun and familiar, and for me the only particularly memorable things aesthetically in the whole of Exo Zombies. Don't get me wrong, there's some cool things like the grenade disposal and carrier, and the whole Rapture-esque vibe going on in Descent that adds an element of interest to the map, but the underwater aspect is underutilised, and the only other interesting bit is the spawn area, and unfortunately there is little reason to go there. Instead of focusing on the unique and iconic aesthetic, Exo Zombies leans way too much on the futuristic and its mundane interiors, which soon all bleed into one another and become very forgettable. Next is a very subjective topic that is heavily influenced by the aesthetic, and that's atmosphere. Like I said, this is quite subjective and not always that tangible. But all the maps in Exo Zombies feel a little dead. Pun most definitely intended. I've discussed this a little before in some of my playthroughs, but the maps seem to lack soul and feel a bit sterile. The whole tone is isolating, like what's going on may not be all that relevant to the world outside that map, and the world itself doesn't feel lived in. Sure, Treyarch Zombies occasionally suffers from some of these problems, but almost all of the maps feel like they'd been lived in before you got there, and furthermore many of the later maps had a dynamic and less sterile feel about them. Take even a map like Transit for example. We can all agree a deeply flawed map, but at least it felt more dynamic instead of sterile, and prior to you getting there the place felt lived in and that it had been through the ringer before you got there. Basically, the whole feeling I get about most of the Exo Zombie maps is that the lights are on, but nobody's home. Plus the audio cues and ambient sound from Black Ops 2 and even Black Ops 1 to a lesser degree really help with the atmosphere of a map. Whereas for the most part, aside from the odd bit of chat from a character or Angie, the audio just became repetitive and annoying. And if there was any ambient sound on any of the maps, I sure as shit didn't notice it. Well, in this area, the game is incredibly lackluster and hasn't had a whole lot of time spent on it, as the only new perk that we got since the initial Outbreak map was Exo Stockpile, which basically gives you more ammo in reserve, which in itself isn't very imaginative. In general, none of the perks are all that imaginative aside from maybe Exo Slam, but even that is similar to one of the abilities of PhD Flopper. Sure, not all of Treyarch's newer perks work, and are all that good, like Tombstone and Who's Who, but at least they're trying to push the boundaries a little. This for me is a particular bone of contention. As with almost all Treyarch maps, you get a bunch of new or different guns thrown into the cycle of the mystery box. But throughout the whole of Exo Zombies, we only got 5 new guns, and that includes special or wonder weapons, whichever you prefer to call them, for this game. Cycling in new guns adds an entirely new element to the enjoyment of acquiring weapons, and adds to the feels about a map, which helps feed into the atmosphere and all that game mechanics malarkey. Why they didn't just put all the missing Advanced Warfare guns into the 3D printer or swap out some of the older guns is beyond me, as the weapon models are already in the game and it wouldn't have took too much effort to implement. The only reason I can think of not doing this is for financial reasons or straight up laziness. Next up is the drops. This one is short but sweet. Although it took a while to add some new drops aside from the trap drop, the ones they have added are fairly imaginative and a bunch of fun to use. This is pretty much the only area that Exo Zombies has outright trumped Treyarch so far. Okay, onto the story. Although Exo Zombies has a story and a moderately engaging narrative, the story only reaches as far as the events of the 5 main characters and their development, and doesn't expand into what's going on in the world as a whole, or works to develop a lore about the things going on in it, be it past, present or future. Like for example the story surrounding what is essentially supporting characters like Samantha and Dr. Maxis, and things like Element 115. Sure, it's much easier for Treyarch to work the whole sci-fi angle, but Sledgehammer had just as much opportunity to make their universe more fantastical, instead of being based in a slightly more realistic universe. I mean, their game mode is called Exo Zombies for God's sake. I don't think anyone would have been too butthurt if they'd have ran with it and made it a brilliant but kind of nonsensical universe like in Treyarch Zombies. And last but by no means least, let's talk game mechanics. Although for the most part, Treyarch's game mechanics for Zombies has changed little, and the reason for that is, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The way Treyarch Zombies plays and feels is a major part of why people like it so much, so why mess with a winning formula? However, Advanced Warfare's big twist on Zombies is the implementation of the exosuit, which adds an extra access in terms of movement with its exo jump ability, which at first was a lot of fun and a cool new dynamic, but after a while the novelty soon wears off, and after you've been shot by an EMP zombie for the umpteenth time, you'll soon realise it's a bit of a gimmick, and just not as fun to play as regular zombies. And those EMP dudes are so annoying, which is why in the later maps they become less and less relevant and more phased out in exchange for different zombie types. Speaking of zombie types, this is something I think they did very well, excluding the EMP zombie. All the different types of zombies and amalgamations of them, from teleport zombies, contaminated zombies, to exploding zombies, and all in between, really help to bring a different dynamic to the gameplay, and to keep things interesting and fresh, as well as stopping the exosuit from becoming OP. So this for me is something to be applauded. Also, I like their new drops and grenade types for the most part, particularly explosive touch, open fire, nano swarm grenades and contact grenades. These are all things that Treyarch Zombies could learn from. But to be honest, the list of things that they could learn from is quite slim. So, to summarise my thoughts on Exo Zombies as compared to Treyarch Zombies is that Exo Zombies found themselves in a tricky situation once they committed to making another Zombies game mode. Partly because of Advanced Warfare's meta and multiplayer game being all about the new mobility of the exosuit, and partly because if they did nothing different to their Zombies game type, they would be straight up accused of copying Treyarch's game mechanics. And if they do inevitably change it, people complain that they don't like the way the new mechanics and abilities affect the game. So they're stuck in a catch-22, in that they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. So in that respect, I feel for Sledgehammer. But this all stems back to messing with a formula and game type they had no business messing with, As with zombies, you're always going to be held up against an impossibly high benchmark by zombie fans, as Treyarch have had 3, soon to be 4 games in which to iterate on the zombies game mode, both to garner loyalty and familiarity, as well to learn how to get it right. Exo Zombies is always going to be playing catch up and will always be compared, be it fairly or not, to Treyarch Zombies. Take the Extinction game mode for example, from Call of Duty Ghosts. Although it's nowhere near as good as Treyarch Zombies, and in my opinion not as good as Exo Zombies, it gets a much easier ride by fans, because Extinction is its own thing, and held up to a much lower standard, whereas Exo Zombies is almost always going to be thought of as a poor man's regular zombies. The Pepsi to Treyarch's Coca-Cola, if you will. For me, I would have preferred it if they'd have made a similar game, less reliant on the exosuits, and had a different, more subtle, new movement mechanic. As for me, once the novelty wore off, they detracted from the fun and general gameplay. Also, they should have featured a different and more supernatural enemy and lore, be it ghosts, vampires, werewolves, robots, or even just generic monsters, whatever. Just something that would breathe life into the lore and universe as a whole, and wouldn't be as harshly compared to the yardstick that is Treyarch Zombies. So, to summarise my summary, within this summary I have surmised that Exo Zombies is a good game mode in its own right, and there is a lot of fun to be had playing it, but isn't as fun or engaging both in terms of gameplay and story. So it's not a knockout for Treyarch when duking it out with Exo Zombies, but it's a clear points decision in the favour of Treyarch. So, that was my thoughts on Exo Zombies as compared to Treyarch Zombies. Feel free to hit me up in the comments with the things you did or didn't like from Advanced Warfare's Exo Zombies mode, and where you'd like to see them go in the future. So, as per usual, this just leaves me to say if you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, share and subscribe for more BS of a similar nature. Thank you and goodbye.